Half-Life is one of the most influential first-person shooters of all time. Nothing can take that title away from Half-Life 1, and the Half-Life series is highly celebrated in the world of gaming. I made a video before on why I personally don't get much enjoyment out of the original Half-Life, and how I don't put it on the same pedestal as I do with Doom, Quake, or Duke Nukem. That's not to say that Half-Life is an overrated game or anything, since I think that would be a pretty egotistical statement to make. Just because I don't like a game as much as everyone else, that doesn't mean that it's automatically overrated. Half-Life is a deceptively tactical shooter, and since the main character, Gordon Freeman, is a scientist and not a Black Ops Marine, this slower paced gameplay makes sense. Instead of blasting through corridors and killing hordes of monsters, Half-Life requires players to be more patient and systematically pick off enemies. The enemy AI is more intelligent than standard Doom or Quake monsters, and they will ambush you if you aren't taking the right precautions. A lot of people love the combat loop that Half-Life has to offer, but looking back, I prefer the more frantic gameplay of other 90s FPS games instead. I respect what Half-Life does in terms of storytelling and having carefully constructed set pieces, but it's not what I immediately turn to when I think of the best first-person shooters ever made. The tram ride sequence in the beginning of the game is boring, and even when I'm trying to take in the atmosphere, I don't get much out of it. The introduction is way too slow-paced in my opinion, and it takes a while until the action ramps up. The physics puzzles might have been impressive at the time, but they just feel novel now, and the way that Gordon slides around like an asshole when you're doing the platforming sections is kinda frustrating. The story unfolds right in front of your eyes, which was innovative at the time, but that storytelling format has evolved in later games. All of that is the underlying reason why some people might dislike Half-Life. It actually boils down to the phenomenon known as Seinfeld is unfunny. Now, Seinfeld is one of the most defining pieces in its genre, and it paved the way for future projects to come. Sounds familiar, right? Yeah, well, Seinfeld was one of the first big comedy shows where each episode revolved around nothing, and featured terrible, unlikable characters. This doesn't sound impressive nowadays because we have plenty of shows that do the exact same thing, and the genre has evolved forward. It's Always Sunny, Peep Show, and more have pushed the boat out, and if younger generations go back to Seinfeld, they might think it's unfunny or dated by comparison. So the TV tropes definition of this phenomenon goes like this. There are certain shows that you can safely assume most people have seen. These shows were considered fantastic when they first aired. Now, however, these shows have a hype backlash curse on them. Whenever we watch them, we'll cry, "That is so old," or "That is so overdone." The sad irony, it wasn't old or overdone when they did it, because they were the first ones to do it. But the things it created were so brilliant and popular, they became woven into the fabric of that show's genre. They ended up being taken for granted, copied, and endlessly repeated. Although they often began by saying something new, they in turn became the new status quo. Half-Life is basically the Seinfeld of the story-driven first-person shooter market. This game's story is presented to the player seamlessly, with no additional cutscenes or anything, and this has carried over into shooters like Ion Fury. Half-Life is linear, of course, but there are still plenty of ways that you can take out enemies, infusing the new school and old school rules of FPS level design. Those physics puzzles that don't really work as well as they did back in 1998, yeah, it's because Half-Life invented them. Half-Life is not my favorite FPS game at all, but it's weird for me to say that it's inherently not good, because that's like saying Seinfeld is unfunny when it evolved the genre forward from what we previously knew. Of course you're entitled to dislike Half-Life, I don't really like the game myself, but it's important to know how it revolutionized the genre and why people enjoy the series to begin with.
What do I know? Spend a night head shaking, where will I go? I can fly with my eyes closed, but it can kinda hard to see, there's no surprise though. I don't move my feet when I be blind.